Добрый день всем, кто нас смотрит.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, colleagues. First of all, I would like to introduce to you our panelists. Leonid Borodkin, the head of the Department of Historical Informatics, Lomonosov Moscow State University. Alexey Kasyan, senior scientist, STEPS RANEPA. And Fedor Uspensky, director of the Institute of Russian Language of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And
Nikolai,
the moderator of this discussion, it will be me, Nikolai Grintser, director of ION RANEPA. Dear colleagues, let us discuss humanities in the 21st century. First, I would like to outline and suggest the topic that seems natural to me to start our discussion. I think that you know that the humanities have to convince the audience all the time, to convince people of the fact that they are needed. I think, in fact, the reasoning here is quite obvious, and it is obvious to you as you are the experts. But lately we've been talking a lot about digitalization and about the application of precise scientific methods and their incursion into all scientific processes. And that prompted the discussion about, well, if not death, but at least the transformation and rebirth of the humanitarian knowledge. I'm quite skeptical about that, as I've been always doing my research in the field of antique ages, and I know that we had those worrying prophecies since those antique times, and we know that these scientists of that time, like Aristotle, they were predicting that new knowledge will kill the advance of sciences. And even Plato was predicting that, for example, book printing will once again play to the deterioration of the humanitarian knowledge. And now we're discussing digital technologies. So the question of today is whether it's just another tool or it's something new. If it's a tool, then what it gives to the humanitarian knowledge, and if not, if it's something bigger, then let's discuss how the humanitarian knowledge is going to change due to these technologies. That's a short introduction from me, and then I would like to ask you about what digital knowledge and digitalization changed for you in what you do. Let's start in the alphabetical order. Leonid, it's over to you. Borodkin. Well, I think the topic of our discussion is very relevant today. It is not for nothing that we have historians and other representatives of the humanitarian knowledge present here, because we need to respond to this advent of digital technologies. It's been happening for quite a few years, for dozens of years. The historians know that several decades ago we've seen the advent of quantitative history, historical information science, and it's been 30 years since we started discussing these new trends that were brought by digital technologies and everything that Nikolai has just mentioned. Based on this experience that was generated by quantitative history or digital linguistics, well, I think the results are quite extensive. What we've seen over the last decades is mostly digitalization. Historians discovered all the different sources of information that were not digitized and therefore accessible before, and now we can access from our desktop huge libraries and huge amounts of information and data. The question is how digitalization changes methods of our research work and how it changes the procedure and the mere process of our research work that we hold in the domain of history. We can discuss that later on, but for now, I can say that these processes spurred the development of digital humanities. Mostly they are represented by linguistics, philology, and history, although linguistics is still a dominating trend. And under this umbrella, we see the accumulation of new methods and approaches that are employed by humanitarians. As to history, on one hand, we have historical information that uses these new methods, applying them to study history. We are looking at different aspects, the social aspect, political demography, and here we use these digital tools and we use those huge amounts of data, and that gives us new opportunities for research. As to digital history, this science looks rather at providing access to digitized libraries and collections. For example, digital public history is one of the results of digital history development. So, on one hand, we use these new methods to gain new knowledge, and on the other hand, we come up with a new scientific and research infrastructure. But since we started talking about new methods applied in linguistics, Alexey, it's over to you. Kasyan. Well, you mentioned that the humanities have to prove their being useful and their relevance for people. I would like to reword that slightly. Our domain is trying to convince people that we are actually in a science. I don't think there is any doubt that our domain is useful, but we still need to prove that we are a science. And digitalization here actually drives us towards being a hard science, because we fall under this set of criteria. As to how digitalization changed linguistics, well, in fact, we rely less and less on memory, and before, experts, they indeed had to have very good memory, but today it's enough to have a body of texts from Latin authors, from all the relevant authors, and there you can find all the information you need with the comments and references. So before that, you had to memorize all those pieces of information. Right now, we can use a memory stick. So that's a big shift. That's a change, and this paved the way and opened, made more accessible this science to people who don't have such a good memory, and it actually changed the overall methodology of training in this domain. I perceive this as a change. I don't think whether it's good or bad. I don't know whether it's good or bad. It's just happening. And I can give you more details in the next round of discussion. Grintser, Right you are. In fact, human memory, we've seen it shrinking back in the time. That happened already. In fact, literacy did that to us as well. We, on one hand, are getting new opportunities. On the other hand, we're losing some. Mr. Uspensky, over to you. Well, I cannot see what is going to happen in the future, but for now, I rather perceive digitalization as a tool. But at the same time, we have to admit many things will change. Mr. Kasyan mentioned huge bodies of text that researchers can use. This mere fact already changes the landscape and research processes. There are also certain traps and dangers in using and applying these tools everywhere. Right now we are actively using digitalization. It's trendy. And in many domains of humanities, very often we substitute primary sources by technologies, and we forget about the use of primary sources. I remember a technological change back in the time. I remember my first time using a copying machine. I had to copy many primary sources from making copies of books in the library, and I remember that I realized at a certain moment that I treat a copied book as a book that I've read. It is not so, and you have to feel this difference. At the same time, there are changes that were supported by new tools and new technologies. As an example, we can look at the we can look at the body of the Russian language, and it is quite obvious. You know, many linguists, in fact, forget the living language, and they rather refer to the databases that they work in. They forget how to work with the real corpus of language. But at the same time, I think that we need to warn young researchers about that we don't have to try and avoid that altogether. So I think that digital technologies are versatile tools, and they help me a lot in my research and in the research work held by the Russian Language Institutes. The statistical methods give us brilliant opportunities of working with dictionaries, and dictionaries, in fact, change a lot thanks to digitalization. But at the same time, I still perceive digital technologies as a tool. Grintser, I think we all agree and our points of view converge, but let me pick on some details that were mentioned here. Alexey mentioned that scientists studying antique age and antique period in the 19th century and in the 20th century, these are two different scientists. All the scientists that were relying on their memory a lot, and they could quote different sources. Today,
либо гонит ли стаж, либо просто нажал несколько кнопок.
Today we understand that
Это уже не то.
if the same thing is happening, it does not assume the same amount of work. So that changes the essence of how texts are being commented.
Что инструмент, тем не менее, меняет.
What I'm trying to say is that the tool itself changes the method of knowledge. And echoing
С одной стороны, да, теперь появляется огромное
what Fedor has said, we do have some scientific papers that quotes other documents by the chapter, but it is not representative. Previously, the crux of the matter was to find a decent source. Now it's not an issue at all. Are there any other examples in your specific domains? What changes were brought about by the digitalization? And not just the sheer amount of data that's been made available. What are the prospects? Where are we going?
Федор Борисович.
Ну, навскидку нет, у меня...
Mr. Uspensky. Well, I think it's happening across the board of humanitarian knowledge.
Первым делом приходит...
One thing that immediately strikes me in particular is this. The second half of the 20th century, the discovery was made how intertextual the poetry of Mandelstam is. And Mr. Gasparov sarcastically mentioned Ronan's work as something worth of being just a footnote instead of making it to the scientific paper itself. So the intertextuality of the Silver Age poets, Mandelstam being just one example. Do you mean the references, allusions, the reminiscences? Uspensky, yes, exactly. Well, all of those become the inner workings of any linguist, and few decent scientists would actually venture publishing it. They would use it as a step on the way to something bigger and better. So what you're saying is that the digital tools make some elements of knowledge excessive or unnecessary, redundant. Mr. Kasyanov. Well, we look at the body of knowledge and the corpuses of many languages, and we see some common features. I think this is a new area of research. We can use the analytical tools to go through big data sets. Most of this data is typically added in the supplement to an article or even published elsewhere on the web. And the paper itself is just the analysis of the data. Previously, the scientific papers were full of linguistic forms and etymology and morphological structures, etc., etc. Now, though, it's different. I can quote the example of my articles. Typically, 80% of the article text is stored on some cloud-based server, and whoever is interested can find the particulars in there. Uspensky. Yes, and I would also stress how open these databases are, which would have never been made possible without the methods at hand. They are enriched and compounded and grow ever richer. Kasyanov. Yes, I think that physicists and genetical scientists have been doing it for a while, and now we follow suit. We are not given the links to findings and conclusions, but to something different. I mean, take any given physicist worth their salt. They will not catalog the number of chemical reactions or physical experiments. They will just add a link to the reference. So the article itself may not be that interesting, but the appendix is where the essence is. So now we try to do the same. The essence is in the appendix. Grintser, do you mean to say that the edge, the border between the hard sciences and soft sciences blur, or perhaps shifts to one way or another? What do you think of it? Kasyan, yes, I do think so. Borodkin, well, historians find it somewhat more difficult. Why so? History is full of ideologems and layers of meanings in every issue. And the quote-unquote digitalizer will not be able to fit into the fabric of the science proper. I want to quote Mr. Fedor, the famous French historian Lefebvre, who imagine an elegant gentleman who stands by by a desk full of drawers and rummaging through the set of cards, trying to find the proper one, the one he needs. Well, that's the picture that comes to mind when you think of the modern historian, Grintser, just like a physicist will do. Borodkin, quite so. Let me quote another example. There are major historical projects under progress right now that can be implemented thanks to big data sets. Today we often quote the example of the Venetian time machine. It's the millennia-old archive that spans across the history of Venice proper and goes beyond, not just limiting itself to the period of its dominion in the history of Europe. Its size and the amount of petabytes, not even terabytes, it's currently being put into a digital form. And the cost is to the tune of €1 billion. And the effort is scattered among major European cities, and the goal is to make a truly public record, which would undergird any research on the demographic structure changes and the population of Venice across a variety of time periods. It can help tracking the social changes in the Venice of the day. The essence is that it is managed by Swiss individual, Swiss researcher that leads a truly talented team that will try to move the needle in the medieval researches quite a bit. Grintser, I got it. So the point is, this becomes a collective effort of what was once an individual attainment. Alexey, do you agree? Kasyanov. Well, I wanted to move on to the detrimental factors and the damage done. Borodkin, may I finish my point? The second interesting thing is another example that can be traced to England. They have a digital collection of the primary data census conducted from 1861 to 1911 in England. They have all data recorded and digitalized. The data was initially designed to serve as a basis for genealogical research, which is truly a genuinely interesting method. But it made its way to historians gratuitously, and now they use it to track the demographic changes in English population, or to look at the process of migration to and from England, so as to understand what could have been expected. They could be used to glean the information on which counties and which towns were the points of origin and points of arrival for the migrants. So this body of knowledge helps us to plant and answer questions that were deemed impossible at the time. Grintser. Okay, so it can be boiled down to this. This is an immensely helpful instrument that can be used for accumulation and analysis of knowledge. You mentioned this, Mr. Uspensky. I mentioned this.
занимаемся в рамках
And this is an effort that we do,
как исследование Алексея Сергеевича в рамках
just like Mr. Kasyanov does in his effort and the international level researches.
консорциуме
It works in conjunction with other universities and institutes in RANEPA, among other places. And the primary texts are openly made available for the public in general. And this, in and of itself, is an indispensable tool. But there is a flip side to it. Certain dangers emerge as we start practicing these new techniques. Let me give you this by way of example. All of us here are teaching in universities, when we know that humanitarian knowledge is impossible without humanitarian teachings and education. So the presence of internet, the Googles of the world and databases opens up a plethora of opportunity for the students. The information is easily available. But from the other hand, all these digital methods, the way I see it, also makes it possible to trace the origins and the authenticity of any paper. And the flip side, although I'm not sure flip side of what, is this, is that we tend to see something peculiar. This new technology changes the way and the common perceptions of what knowledge is and who can be deemed an author of anything. Back in the day when I was a student and we borrowed books from the library, and it was quite clear, well, this is somebody's book, somebody's property. Now, all the information exists, where exactly? In some kind of cloud? It would be difficult to explain to my students that just taking some text from the internet is just as illegal as stealing a book from the library, and they genuinely do not understand this. The concept is alien to them. So, ever since the time immemorial, we see this anonymization of the knowledge. And perhaps there are other flip sides to other phenomena. And we perhaps should mention this, not just the pros, but the cons as well. Alexey? Kasyanov. Well, anonymity is a big thing, and a contentious point among the humanitarian scholars. Ideas were put forth, let's not put our names on the scientific papers and just assess the quality of the work and not just the merits of the author. Well, the needle has never been moved quite in this debate. As we work with the colleagues from the United States and Europe, we share the lessons learned of the experiences of papers published in scientific journals, and we agree that we are at the threshold of a major shift, of a tectonic shift in the scientific magazine community and the very idea of publishing scientific articles. But I can't pinpoint what changed, but it has changed, and I think it spreads from the US scientific community. When you publish an article there, you see that something is changing. The peer review structure and other signs, subtle hints let you know that something is different. Uspensky. Oh yes, the concept of the scientific paper and scientific magazine is changing. So we do not know what would be the trend. Kasyanov. We perhaps need to look at the underlying dangers that can entrap us along the way, that we can fall prey to. We all work with databases in one way or another. And I also am a researcher of databases in a variety of languages. We work together with RANEPA on a major joint project. So it made me think, Fedor, you mentioned these databases are almost always open. Well, they are not always. Well, can you quote the criteria of openness, Uspensky? Well, who they are open to for the users? Well, no, I mean you can read them, but you cannot add information to them.
Uspensky, unfortunately, they are not completely open. Kasyan, right. And if, for example, you receive an article for review and you want this article to fail, you can actually briefly write that, in fact, this article uses partly closed data. Borodkin, I didn't know that. Kasyan, well, you know, modern magazines that are quite popular. There, for example, this kind of credibility of an article is much valued. So the first hidden danger is that humanitarian databases, they can contain lots of errors, different types of those. Sometimes those are just typos, and sometimes that is those are intentionally falsified pieces of information. For example, well, it's same as with the lab, for example, laboratories that perform different types of tests. Once in a while, you perform cross-examination in order to make sure that the results are accurate. The results of different laboratories must match, and therefore there it is more difficult to fake information, and it is much easier to identify cases of falsification there comparing to humanitarian knowledge. And if, for example, you have a researcher who developed a body of knowledge on Pirhan language of the language of people who live in Amazon forests, sometimes the information about those languages are totally lied. For example, there was one case when a language from Australia was described, but in fact that language was a dead language. There are cases like that in anthropology too. There are, for example, databases that you cannot verify. You don't know whether this database was developed in a library from someone's laptop or that is real information. Probably you remember, back in the Soviet time, we had internships, field practice, and some students that were going into those expeditions were quite meticulous. They were collecting primary data, and other students, they were just filling in questionnaires randomly. They were inventing results and responses. Grintser, well, verifications has always been an important issue here. Kasyan, right you are, but today we very often hear strong statements made on the basis of falsified databases and unreliable data. Problem number two is mathematical analysis. Because we want to derive some kind of statistics from those huge amounts of data. Humanitarian researchers are not always good at that. Once I discussed this with an information technologies expert. We discussed a linguistic article. It was about languages of certain peoples, and this expert, he asked for my opinion. We read the article together, and we realized that unfortunately the statistics that was the foundation of that article was quite weak. And he said that it is quite often the case, and humanitarians, and then I quote this person, that humanitarians often use statistics as a metaphor. So I think that indeed, it is true that humanitarians are very bad at using statistics, and unfortunately we do not use the expertise of mathematicians here enough. Now, I think that we also need to cross out philosophy as a discipline from higher institutions' curriculum. But at the same time, I would like to introduce a course on theory of relativity for people to be able to understand how to analyze the case, the descriptions of a boiling kettle. They should be able to distinguish between a coincidence and a cultural reference. Grintser, well, I think that, in fact, this kind of collisions and difficulties, they will always be arising. Borodkin, I'd like to add that, in fact, this topic indeed is very relevant. Today we have huge masses of data, terabytes of those, and we also have effective tools that we can use to work with those amounts of data. But at the same time, the information has become very accessible, but unfortunately very often we use obsolete tools. Our students in our department study mathematical statistics, theory of relativity, and as to data science, that's one of the most popular and advanced domain of research today. We present this knowledge to our students too, but unfortunately they do not use those tools. And we see how later on they use statistics in a wrong way, and as my colleague has rightly said, very seldom they work with the mathematicians performing their research. So we have lots of data and we lack proper tools. History is an interdisciplinary science. We always have experts in every domain of knowledge, and they use sets of tools pertaining to that domain of knowledge. Like, for example, economists use tools of econometrics, and they apply corresponding methods there as well. But there is this problem of the disbalance of accessibility of data and lack of tools. Thank you. Mr. Uspensky, do you have any comment? Well, I don't think I have a lot to add to what's been said, but if we look at the gap between humanities and sciences, I agree here that the borderline between those is being blurred, but I still think that the essence of the humanities is abstract description methods that these disciplines use. Humanities rely a lot on description. However, we should rather focus on problematization of the information that we are working with. I think that digitalization will highlight this problem later on, but before that happens, we will still see how methods used in humanities will be in disbalance. Unfortunately, as of now, digital technologies do not help to systematize these methods. For example, you mentioned the Venice time machine. A lot of resources are invested into that project, and people think that they've done that, and that makes this work done and completed. In fact, it is not the case. It happens very often in the humanities. People think that they will do something, and researchers after me will analyze the information that I created. Unfortunately, this trend intensifies over time. I don't know whether it's the case in sciences. Grintser. Well, on one hand, I think that all these opportunities to describe much more information than before, that creates this misperception that the work stops at that, and memory is becoming not an indispensable tool, intensifies that trend as well. But in fact, I think it does not lift the need to problematize the information that you found. In fact, you have to pose questions to those sets of data that you created, and that's what, in fact, that's how a good researcher differs from a bad one. I think that digitalization and digital technologies make this problem even more obvious than before. Wrapping up and drawing a line under this discussion, I'd like to say that, well, I think it's very characteristic of humanitarians. We cannot answer, we cannot give a clear-cut answer to any of the questions we've posed today. But at the same time, we can state that, yes, these new tools allow us to reinterpret the humanitarian knowledge, and at the same time, sometimes these tools open new areas of knowledge, making some other areas of knowledge redundant or useless. So there are always upsides and downsides. They operate in a balance. And in fact, I think that this discussion about humanitarians and digital technologies, it drives us to the conclusion that, in fact, for example, studying the antique knowledge and ancient languages, we see that the most archaic period becomes the most digital one and turned into a novel. Our experts on folklore, they prove that here in RANEPA, and they, for example, prove that the distribution and the spread of knowledge across internet confirms and repeats the archetypes of the knowledge spread the way it was happening in ancient times. I think that in humanities it has always been important to pose questions, and a humanitarian, an expert in humanities, was always supposed to know where the information can be checked and verified. They had to know how to double-check it. And digital technologies help us with that. It's very important to double-check at all times. Thank you very much. And at that, I would like to call it a discussion if you're not against that. Thank you very much for this conversation, and I would like to also thank the Guide Forum for bringing us together for this discussion. Thank you.